The beekeeper loading the last hive onto the flatbed didn't look up. "You'll be lucky if 20 of these make it to March." Ruth Calder didn't answer right away. She was looking past him at 180 white boxes stacked crooked in the frost, lids cracked, corners chewed soft by mice. Somewhere inside them, bees were clustered so tight and so still that the whole yard sounded almost silent. Everyone standing in that yard that morning believed those colonies were finished. By spring, orchard owners 3 counties over would be calling her, asking if she had any hives left to spare. Nobody there that January morning, least of all Ruth, could have told you how that was going to happen. She grew up 3 miles down the county road in a farmhouse that still smelled faintly of beeswax, no matter how many years passed since her grandfather worked the hives behind the barn. He'd been gone 6 winters. Her husband, too. She kept 20 colonies of her own now, just enough to feel like the quiet wasn't total. The man loading the truck was Delbert Hoyt, who'd run pollination bees up and down 3 states for 20-some years. A December cold snap had gutted his operation. Queens failing, populations crashed to nothing, comb ruined by damp. Rebuilding 180 weak colonies wasn't worth his time. Starting over with fresh packages in spring was. "Cheaper to burn 'em and start clean," he said, not cruelly, just tired. Ruth watched a handful of bees crawl along a hive entrance, trying to soak up what little warmth the January sun offered. She thought of her grandfather's voice, worn smooth by memory. "A weak colony isn't a dead colony, Ruthie. It's just a colony nobody's fed yet." "What do you want for all of them?" she asked. Delbert laughed under his breath, like she'd misheard herself. Then he named a number so low it insulted the bees more than it insulted her bank account. She wrote the check before she let herself think twice. Would you have taken that risk or walked away like everyone else in that yard clearly wanted to? That's the kind of decision that splits a community, and it's worth sitting with for a second before the story moves on. She didn't tell her sister what she'd spent. She didn't tell anyone. She just made trip after trip down the county road, hauling broken colonies back to the clearing behind her barn, until 180 hives sat waiting for her in the cold, and her savings account sat a good deal thinner than it had that morning. That night she opened her grandfather's old beekeeping journal at the kitchen table, its pages soft as cloth, and started making a plan she wasn't fully sure would work. But were the queens even still alive in half of these? She wouldn't know until she opened the first box. The first inspections told her more than she wanted to know. Colony after colony showed the same story, a cluster too small to hold its own heat, comb spotted with mold, no sign of a queen at all in nearly 30 boxes. She marked each dead queen hive with a chalk X, knowing those would need combined with stronger colonies or lost outright. 11 colonies she found completely silent by the second week, bees frozen mid-huddle around a queen who simply hadn't been strong enough to hold them together. She sat on an overturned bucket after that and let herself cry for a while, not just for the bees. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve and went back to work, because the ones that were still alive couldn't wait for her grief to finish. Steam rose off 5-gallon batches of sugar syrup before sunrise, and Ruth carried it hive to hive across frozen grass, while her breath fogged in the porch light. She wrapped the weakest colonies in insulating boxes her grandfather had built decades earlier, untouched in the hayloft until now, and shrank their entrances down to a single bee's width, so a small cluster wouldn't waste what little heat it had. Defending territory it couldn't fill. Money went where it had to. New woodenware for the worst damaged boxes, or another round of pollen patties to jumpstart brood before the fruit trees bloomed. She couldn't always afford both. More than once she stood in the feed store parking lot, doing the math twice before deciding. The feed store's owner extended her credit without being asked, then quietly stopped mentioning it. Not everyone was as generous. 180 hives, her neighbor Walt, Pruitt said one morning, leaning on her fence with the particular tone of a man who'd already made up his mind. From Hoyt's junk pile. They're not junk, Ruth said. He's run bees longer than you've been alive, Ruth. If he couldn't save them, he didn't try, she said. He didn't have the time to try. I do. Walt didn't argue further, but she could feel the county's opinion of her settling in around her anyway, the way it does in small places, in the pause before someone asks how she's holding up, in the glances at church, in the things people say to each other, and not to her. Spent her savings on dying bees, grieving and not thinking straight. Somebody ought to talk to her before she loses the farm, too. She heard all of it. She kept working anyway. Late February brought the storm nobody had forecast properly. 2 days of hard freeze and wind that rattled the barn siding and dropped temperatures into the single digits overnight. Ruth spent both nights outside with a flashlight, checking windbreaks she'd built from scrap plywood and hay bales, making sure the weakest colonies hadn't been exposed by a shifted tarp or a loosened lid. She lost 14 more colonies to that storm, bringing her total losses to 25, with more than 150 still hanging on by threads she couldn't always see. Was the storm going to be the thing that finished what Delbert had started? For 2 or 3 days, it genuinely felt that way. An old family friend, a retired beekeeper named Otto Meinert, who'd worked bees in the valley for 50 years before his knees gave out, came by one afternoon to look over her operation. He didn't say much, just walked the rows slowly, lifting a lid here and there, nodding to himself. "You're doing this right," he finally said. "Slower than most people have the patience for. That's usually why it works." It was the first thing anyone outside her own head had said that sounded like belief instead of pity, and she held on to it longer than she probably should have. By early March, Colony 42, one of the sickest hives she'd bought, barely a double handful of bees when it arrived, had grown strong enough that she had to add a second box just to give it room. It was the first colony she'd fully saved, and she stood over it a long moment before she let herself believe it. Others followed more slowly, a tight, healthy brood pattern here, a queen laying with real confidence there. Small victories that meant nothing to anyone driving past her fence line, but meant everything to her. One frame at a time. Not every fight was against the cold. Mites had taken hold in a dozen of the weaker colonies over the winter, riding along on bees too exhausted to groom them off, and Ruth spent a week treating what she could without stressing hives already running on empty. She lost 3 more to it before she got ahead of the problem. A quiet, unglamorous kind of loss that didn't come with a dramatic storm attached, just the slow arithmetic of disease, finding the weakest link first. She also learned to read a nectar flow the way her grandfather once had, watching which fields greened first, which fence lines carried early clover, which hollows held frost the longest and starved a colony of forage days after everyone else's bees were already flying. She moved a dozen hives twice that spring, chasing bloom instead of waiting for it to arrive, because a colony that couldn't reach food might as well not have survived the winter at all. If you'd bought 180 dying colonies on a gamble like this, would you have kept going after losing 25 of them? Tell us in the comments, because Ruth wasn't entirely sure she would have blamed herself for quitting. By the last week of March, she had 132 surviving colonies. Not thriving yet, most of them, but alive and growing. If stories like this one, the ones about people who refuse to give up on what everyone else already wrote off, are the kind of thing you come back for, this is a good moment to subscribe to Heartacre Stories, because Ruth's hardest test hadn't happened yet. It arrived from an unexpected direction. A fungal disease had moved through several of the region's largest commercial pollination operations that winter, compounding losses from the same brutal cold that gutted Delbert's business in December. By the time apple and cherry bloom approached, growers across 3 counties who'd never once worried about finding healthy hives were suddenly short. The first call came from Ed Sawinski, an apple grower Ruth knew mostly by a nod at the feed store. He sounded like a man asking for something he'd rather not need. "Heard you've got more hives out there than your own place could use," he said. "I might," Ruth said carefully. "You renting any?" "For pollination?" She hadn't planned on it. She'd bought those colonies to save them, not to build a business out of them. But 132 hives was more than her own acreage needed, and Ed's orchard was 4 miles away. "I'll bring 20, she said. "We'll see how they do." Would rescued colonies even work as hard as healthy commercial stock? Nobody, including Ruth, knew the answer until the bees started flying. The 20 hives she placed in Ed's orchard that first week of April worked exactly the way bees always work when they're given a job and enough forage to do it. Within days, his orchard was humming louder than it had in years. Blossoms worked steadily row after row from the moment the morning dew burned off. Ed called again before the week was out. "Whatever you did with those bees," he said, "keep doing it." But one impressed grower wasn't a trend. It was one man taking a chance on a neighbor. The real test was whether it would spread past his fence line at all. It spread slowly at first, the way real things do. A grower down the road from Ed noticed his neighbor's bloom set looked heavier than usual and asked why. Someone in the county extension office, fielding calls about the commercial hive shortage, remembered hearing about the woman who'd bought Delbert Hoyt's worthless bees back in January and mentioned her name almost as an afterthought. By the second week of April, Ruth's phone was ringing in a way it hadn't in years. She didn't raise her rates and she didn't rush a single delivery. She walked every orchard herself, checking sun exposure, checking spacing, treating each new placement with the same care she'd given the sickest colony back in February. Delbert Hoyt heard about it from a supplier before he heard it from Ruth herself. He drove out to her place unannounced one afternoon in late April and stood at the edge of the yard looking at rows of hives that, 4 months earlier, he'd been ready to burn. "I figured most of these wouldn't see April," he admitted. "Most of the weak ones didn't," Ruth said. "The ones that made it just needed somebody to give them a chance." He didn't say much after that, but he started sending his own struggling colonies her way that summer, instead of writing them off, which was, for a man like Delbert, close enough to an apology. By the end of April, 40 of Ruth's colonies were working across 6 orchards, with more requests coming in than she could currently fill. She started a waiting list, something that would have seemed almost absurd to her back in January, standing in Delbert's yard, wondering if she'd just made the worst decision of her life. Walt Pruitt showed up at her gate in early May, hat in his hands. "Heard the orchards are lining up for your bees now," he said. "They are," Ruth said without an edge in her voice. "I was wrong about this," he admitted. "Wrong about most of it, probably." She didn't rub it in. She just asked if his own trees could use a few hives that season, and he said yes before she'd finished the sentence. So, did the rescued bees actually outperform healthy commercial hives? Or did the growers just want to believe a good story? By late May, the blossom counts answered that question better than anyone's opinion could. Orchards that had struggled with thin, patchy pollination in past years were reporting some of the fullest bloom sets growers could remember. Fruit set came in heavier across the board. Growers who'd been lukewarm in March were now asking Ruth to reserve hives for next spring before the current season had even finished. By midsummer, 107 surviving colonies, The ones that had made it through that brutal winter, that late freeze, and every setback in between, were working across 9 different orchards. Waiting lists stretched into the following year. Otto Mehnert started stopping by more often, not to check on her work anymore, but just to sit on the porch and listen to bees he no longer needed to worry about. Even the orchard managers who'd been hardest to convince came around. One, a cautious woman named Carol Vance, who managed nearly 200 acres of cherries for an out-of-state owner, had turned Ruth down flat in April, telling her the operation couldn't afford to gamble on unproven hives during a shortage that already had her nervous. By July, after hearing what Ed's and Walt's orchards had produced, she called back and asked if there was any way to get on the list for next spring. Ruth told her the truth, that the list was already long, but that she'd remember who asked first. One evening in early June, Ruth stood at the edge of her own orchard as the light went gold and low. Bees moved steadily between blossoms in numbers that hadn't existed on this farm in years, and the hum rising off the hives had a fullness to it she hadn't heard since her grandfather was alive to hear it with her. She thought about the check she'd written in Delbert's yard, how reckless it had felt at the time. About the 11 colonies she'd lost that first cold week, and the 14 more after the storm. And every night she'd stood outside with a flashlight, wondering if she was only prolonging something already decided. She thought about her grandfather's voice in that old journal, and wondered, not for the first time, if he'd been talking about more than bees. She hadn't set out to build anything. She'd set out to save something everyone else had already agreed to lose, because she couldn't stand watching it happen for the sake of convenience. Everything that followed, the calls, the waiting list, the income that finally let her breathe again, had simply been what happened when patience was given enough time to prove itself right. If this is the kind of ending you were hoping for, let us know what you think happens to Ruth's operation next year. And stick around, because there's a lot more of this farm's story still to tell. The barn that had sat quiet for 2 long years was surrounded by sound again by the time that summer ended. The low, steady hum of colonies that had once been given up for dead. Working orchards that stretched further each season than the one before. Rows of hives stood where there had only been silence in January. The county that once assumed she'd wasted everything now waited in line for what she'd built out of what everyone else was ready to throw away. The greatest harvest, it turns out, doesn't always start in the strongest soil. Sometimes it starts with someone willing to keep feeding what everyone else had already decided wasn't worth saving. Like this video, subscribe to Hardacre Stories for more true rural stories of quiet determination, and stay for the next one, because the hardest years on a farm are usually the ones that end up mattering most.